Hello, I'm Robert, and helping if you're scared of many things. And the media's just going crazy about this supposed win by Russia, but it's nothing. Russia's really lost rather than won. So, first of all, Russia's lost an army that is larger than the entire army of Netherlands or Portugal. Nearly more than half the size of the Romanian army, and about a third of the size of the entire United Kingdom army. It lost this army in 4 months, and what did it achieve? And these soldiers completely lost, killed or out of action, and Russia can't use them again. And it lost nearly 400 tanks as well. It's a large number of tanks. And what did they achieve? Well, this is what they managed to take. This is about the size of Bognor Regis. So this is just to give you an idea. If you live in London or in the south of the United Kingdom, you will know of Bognor Regis as a kind of seaside resort, and it's about 25,000. Avdiivka is about 25,000. It's about the same size. And Palm Springs in the United States, if you want an example there, it's about the same size, same number of people, although Palm Springs would be larger in area. And here's a satellite photo, and this shows nearly all of Avdiivka. And if you look in closely, most of it is just a residential area. And it's basically, if you scroll down here, it's basically on the outskirts of Donetsk. Donetsk has a population of about 2 million, and that's been held by Russian separatists. They got it in 2014, and now it's taken over by Russia. And it's a little city on its outskirts, which heavily fortified, which Ukraine had managed to hold on to all this time. And that little yellow area is the bit that Russia has managed to push Ukraine out of that. But Ukraine wasn't going anywhere. There's no way that Ukraine was going to achieve much from Avdiivka going any further. It was just heading towards the outskirts of Donetsk. It's going to need something much more major later on, like cutting through the supply routes to Donetsk. It's going to be some big campaign later on. This is not anything to do with anything. It's just a fortified city that Ukraine has kept all this time. It's got one major railway line that goes through it. You go down to that map. And I don't know if it shows the railway line, but the railway line goes through it like that and into Ukrainian territory. So there's no great value to Russia. What it can do with that railway line is send soldiers from Donetsk to Avdiivka. What's the point in that? And it has got a small industrial area. It's got the factory of metallic structures, a quartz sand quarry, and a few other things. But Russia, in its advances through like Severodonetsk, where it destroyed the fertilizer factory, and in Mariupol, where it completely destroyed the Azov steel works, it just destroys all the factories as it goes through these places. So they're utterly useless to it. It's essentially just managed to find itself a sandcastle, because that's all it's demolished it to a pile of rubble. It's just playing king of the sand on two piles of rubble. Avdiivka and Bakhmut was equally pointless. And this is open source, so we know it lost 364 tanks according to Ukraine, and they tend to match the open source, and slightly over, but then that's not surprising because they have better data. And this is open source for Avdiivka, and they say they have got photos of 224 tanks that Russia lost, and 359 armoured vehicles, and they've got photos of 21 tanks that Ukraine lost, and 20 armoured vehicles. So it's a huge difference. It's more than 10 times. And it would normally be, for the attacker, they have a disadvantage, which would normally be 3 times. Here it's much more than 10 times. So that's a huge, huge loss, and Ukraine hasn't lost much at all. Now if we go back down to the bigger picture, and we look at the wins that, these are basically the wins in 2023, I think, to 2024, to now. So Ukraine, with advanced all the way through the Russian minefields here, extremely hard to get through. And this is a very significant victory that it made, although it was too late in the year for it to build on it. It took all summer, and then if the US aid packet had come through in time, and in spite of lots of ATACMS and lots of equipment in the fall of 2023, then Ukraine might have been able to do a big counter-offensive. But nothing came through. It got a few ATACMS, and then that was it, because the aid just dried up because it was blocked in Congress. So that's basically what happened. Is not that there's any risk of Ukraine losing, but they just got a bit stuck because they needed more equipment in order to not counter-offensive. And they also needed some control of the air, because if they've got this little pocket here, if they went pushing through and they got Tokmak, say, which is the big thing that they're headed for next from here, then their soldiers there would be in a kind of inlet like that. They'd have fighter jets flying over them. They'd be very vulnerable from the air until Ukraine managed to get its artillery in, and its counter-artillery and its air defences into that pocket. And so, and then to complicate it even more, Russia and Ukraine both have lots of these small drones that are flying back and forth all along the front line. So that is why it all came to a stop. And then these minefields were very, very dense, and NATO countries were nervous about giving all their mine equipment, or a significant amount of their mine equipment, so they didn't give very much minefield breaching equipment to Ukraine. And then it wasn't designed for a wide enough minefield. Like they have a rope that is supposed to go right across the minefield from one side to the other, and it explodes lots of mines, and then you're supposed to rapidly go through with a special vehicle that sweeps up the mines and clears up behind it and unexplodes other ones, and then you're through. And you're supposed to do all that in about a few tens of minutes. That's how you're supposed to breach a minefield, according to NATO doctrine. But this was not long enough for the rope to reach from one side to the other. The minefield was much too wide for that. So they would end up in the middle of it. It had twice as many mines as a normal minefield, and was much deeper. So it made it much harder to do. And then what made it even worse is that Russia had got little garrisons, little fortifications in every single tree line, and lots of small hedges and fields in this part of the area with tree lines between each field. And so the minefields went across many fields, and so the Ukrainians had to go through one field line, then another tree line, then another tree line to cross the minefield. And then to make it even harder for that, Russia had wired up all the minefields so that they would notice within minutes if big heavy armoured vehicles came towards them. So instead of the 10 or 20 minutes advantage that NATO doctrine counts on, there's only minutes of advantage. So you've got a few tens of seconds, they go driving in, immediately Russia starts attacking them, they drop mines behind them as they advance, and they shell their armoured vehicles. So that was why Ukraine couldn't use the NATO doctrine. It couldn't use the NATO approach to go through these minefields, because it simply didn't work. The ropes could have gone all the way through, but they weren't long enough. The idea of charging through before Russia noticed didn't work at all, because they didn't even have 10 or 20 minutes. And NATO could still have done it, with their F-35 fighter jets if they were fighting. But Ukraine has got the disadvantage in the air, that the Russian fighter jets can fly higher, and the Ukrainians have to fly close to the ground. It's very difficult for them in this situation to protect their soldiers from above. When you get the F-16s, it'll be much easier. And then there was the problem of the drones and the dropping the mines behind them as they advance. And so they did a try with the tanks, and they sent a few Leopard tanks, and some of them were destroyed, some were damaged and had to be returned. And they tried the mine breaching approach of NATO. They did that in spring 2023, and it just didn't work. And then there were lots of NATO allies saying, go on, go for it, just put everything we've got into it and rush through. And Ukraine was saying, no, this isn't working, your doctrine hasn't worked. And then armchair critics were saying, it's just because they're not used to using them, they're not used to combined forces, they're not working together properly. But it became abundantly clear within a few weeks that it's simply the NATO equipment was not up to task for what Ukraine was trying to do. So what Ukraine did instead is they sent lots and lots of small platoons of maybe 10 soldiers at a time, very risky work, demining by hand. And they sent thousands of them, tens of thousands I think eventually, so you'd be a little platoon of 8 or 10 people, and you just dash into the minefield, try and keep hidden behind things. You'd remove the mines by hand, bit by bit, and then as soon as the Russians notice you, which they wouldn't notice as quickly as if it was an armoured vehicle, then you'd rush back again. And then you'd clear a little bit by that way, and then another platoon would go through the bit you cleared and get another bit, and then they kind of cycle around between each other. And then eventually they'd come to the tree line, they'd sneak up the tree line, and they'd rush the Russian fortifications in the tree lines. And then once they got through the tree line, they'd then start doing the same with the next field and the next field. And that's why it took all summer, because that's a very, very slow process. And then they also tried detonating remotely by sending drones to try and detonate the mines, and they detected the mines by infrared because they warm up. They're warmer at certain, like when it goes to the evening, when it cools down, the mines retain the warmth a little bit longer, so you can detect them and you can see where they all are. And so using lots of different methods, the Ukrainians eventually, they cleared that entire area of mines, and they got through, and they went all the way through, and they went through the tank barriers. And that was where they were at the end of summer 2023. And they did it only one place for overtime, because it was a very exhaustive, very difficult work, and they focused on it one place and went through and through and through. Now, they're through the first two lines of the Russian defences, and Russia has a third line, and it's Surovikin line, I think it's called. There was this general who is the one who devised the very deep minefields that Russia has, and devised the anti-tank fortifications. And this is one of the very dim things that Russia does. But Putin, when he finds that the general is particularly good, he dismisses them, because he feels it's a threat to him. So in 2023 to 24, Russia no longer have Surovikin as a general, because he was too good. And so his doctrine, what Surovikin would have done, he'd have said, right, we've now got to fortify the third line of defences. That's what he built it for. But the very old Soviet Union dogma, stuck in the mud Russian generals that Putin favours, they said what we've got to do is we've got to do lots and lots of counterattacks. And so they sent wave after wave of Russian soldiers to try and fight against the fortifications that the Ukrainians had already, of the positions the Ukrainians had already captured, instead of fortifying a third line. And many of them were killed. And then when they realised they weren't going to capture Obertine that way very easily, and then that's when they said, well, okay, well, we've got this little pocket called Avdiivka, and this will be very politically popular in Donetsk region if we can take Avdiivka. So they did this huge campaign, and they decided this was their winter objective, to take this little pocket here. they've just left that. So still is this big gap in the Russian front lines for Ukraine to exploit. There's another one also, that the mines have been washed away on the Russian side of the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast. And so the Ukrainians have two outposts on the Russian side of the Dnipro River. And if Russia had any sense at all, it would have sent probably half that army to Obertyne and the other half that army to the Dnipro River to push the Ukrainians off the Dnipro River, because they're not that very secure there, where they are across the river, one on the Antonovsky Bridge and the other by the Leshki Sands. And with a big push, Ukraine could probably have pushed them back, because it's very difficult to supply them across the river. And everything has to be supplied over the river. But Russia's not bothering about that. It's just saying, who cares about those people over there? We're going to go to Avdiivka. And they lost 364 tanks and 47,000 soldiers battering away at this totally pointless Avdiivka. And you can see how strategically important this is. Tokmak is a military significant place. If Ukraine can take that, that will make a huge difference to the war, because it gives them, it brings them within artillery range of the military important coastal supply route, which goes from Russia to Kherson Oblast, and it can also come from Crimea, supplying back here, and all the way through that way to Crimea. And if Ukraine was to cut through the Kerch Bridge, which they probably know how to do, and they probably have the ability to do, they're just not doing it yet, because they want the right moment, then the only way to supply Kherson Oblast would be this way, and also the only way to supply Crimea. So then, if Ukraine can cut through here as well, then Kherson Oblast will be lost by the Russians. They won't be able to supply them. Melitopol has lots of partisan fighting, the Ukrainian resistance, and so this you can see why they chose Obertyne as a place to attack. It's between Melitopol and Mariupol, and Mariupol, of course, Ukraine is very keen to liberate. And then there's the coastal route, because Russia has a railway line along here, but it's pretty useless because it's within range of very precise artillery. So most of the supplies go by truck along the road, along the Azov coast. And this is just out of range of the more precise Russian Ukrainian artillery. So Ukraine has these things like HIMARS and the Storm Shadow and so on. They have a very long range, but they're extremely expensive. So they only use them as very high value targets. But their artillery, like the M77s, they just fire lots and lots of shells. And if they could just get through here and just come a little bit further, then the coastal route is within range of the artillery, and then the trucks that go along there will be completely vulnerable to the Ukrainian artillery, which is very low cost. So so that's why in a war, so that's why this is extremely vulnerable. They're not quite close enough to do that yet, but it's a little bit closer, like just about Tokmak area, and that would be enough to already cut through the coastal route, where Russia sends thousands of trucks, I'm not sure how many to day, probably hundreds a day, going back and forth with supplies for Kherson Oblast and going to Crimea and coming back this way. And they have long queues there quite often, and they'd be very vulnerable if Ukraine comes through there. So it's pretty clear that this should have been Russia's top priority, to protect the front line there, but instead they go for this pointless fight here. So now can you see how this is not a win at all to Ukraine, to Russia? Can you see how it's a win to Ukraine? Because Ukraine would have had to fight. If Ukraine was doing a counter-offensive there, then it's the attacker, then it's the disadvantage of Ukraine to Russia. And so Russia has lost those 364 tanks and probably only 30 Ukrainian tanks. Now if it was this other way around, and suppose it was a more reasonable 3-to-1 ratio, then Ukraine would needed 1,000 tanks to counteract those 364, and they're gone. It's not actually as much as that, because Ukraine has far better tanks than the Russian ones, especially the modern ones. They're probably 1 to 10 ratio, the value of them. But you can see how when Ukraine advances to here, if it does, and it seems very likely it will, then when its army is there, and then it's going to, and then, so the way it would do it is it would go all the way through, and then it would try to go both that way and that way, and it would roll back those front lines, because once it's this side of the front line, then the Russian soldiers are very vulnerable and they'll have to retreat. That is the theory of how the Ukrainians, or how an offensive would do if it successfully breaches a front line. Then we go through, go sideways that way, and it would try to undercut the Russians. The Russians, for that matter, if they had a very strong force, would try to cut off the pocket from the inside, like that, on both sides, to prevent them supplying them. And so it's who wins of those two, whether the Russians are able to cut it off from behind, or whether the Ukrainians are able to go side by side and then cut off the entire region for the Russians. And so it's that dynamic is what decides who wins the counter-offensive as they go through. Because it's a little pocket like that is not so bad, but if it's a big pocket like this, just supplied with a little channel, it's very, very hard for Ukraine. So they have to widen it. And so that's how they would do. And so they go that way, they go that way, and then they go that way. And then they go down, and then eventually get to the Crimean, the Azov Sea, which is the Azov coast. And then they'd be wanting to go, and then that would cause problems. It would then bring them within artillery range of Mariupol, if they were to move this way a little bit. And so then once they're within artillery range of Mariupol, that becomes vulnerable. And there's not very much, this open countryside here, it's not much by way of cities. And this is very easy. Once Ukraine go through there, this fighting here is very dry. It doesn't have a mud season. So Ukraine can fight there all year round if they want to. So that's basically the strategic situation as to what might happen next year. Although Ukraine always always has surprises. So, and then there's a pace to the fighting here. So this is winter, and in winter, then if Russia and Ukraine were both sensible, they would both stop fighting, and they just lob missiles at each other over the winter. Except possibly if there was a very cold snap that was cold enough for tanks, and if they were really desperate to make an advance. But apart from that, they wouldn't move at all. And that is the normal pace of operations in a war in the Russian area, where you have the Russian mud, because you have a mud season which goes from the late fall to early spring, and basically from the end of November through to April. Then it's appalling conditions for fighting. Your tanks sink in the mud unless you drive on roads, and of course your tanks are very vulnerable on roads, which may be why Russia's losing so many in this battle, because it can't go off into the fields. And then because the fields become just deep mud this time of year, so deep that if a tank drives into a field, because it's a heavy thing, it'll sink up to its turret. It can even sink below its turret. They dig up ancient World War II tanks that have been completely buried by the mud. They just sunk all the way down, so there's nothing left. So so it's a very stupid time of year because of the Russian battles during the mud season. So so it's a very stupid time of year for tanks. And then for soldiers, it's minus 10 degrees centigrade or 14 degrees Fahrenheit. And those are very bad conditions for fighting in. They get frostbite. If they get a bit wet especially, they get frostbite. They're going to lose fingers, toes, maybe feet. They're going to, and then they are even worse, is that they get, this is if they're fighting on the front line and trying to advance to these extremely cold conditions and hiding in trenches and things. Then they're almost certain to get frostbite and hypothermia, which is even worse. So hypothermia is when you're just losing a lot of heat. You're not eating enough, or you're not getting enough nourishment, and you start to, your body gets very warm, and you start feeling that everything is, that you're just so warm that you start taking your clothes off, and you go a bit delirious, and then soon after that you die. Or you might just feel very sleepy, and you just say, oh, I'm just so tired, I'm so sleepy, what's the point in this war, and they just go to sleep, and that's their last sleep. And so many Russian soldiers die of hypothermia, or they're put out of action because of frostbite and losing bits of their body, and so they can no longer fight anymore. And so that's probably partly why they've lost those 47,000 soldiers. They don't break it down into figures, but probably thousands of those have died of hypothermia or out of action because of frostbite, because of this very stupid time of year to be fighting. And the Ukrainians, they just hunker down, and then as the Russians attack them, they just fire back, and they retreat very slowly. They do occasional counter-offensives to retake little areas. They hide in places that are well fortified, and they spend most of the time flying about drones and using those to destroy the tanks and the vehicles that the Russians are sending towards them. There's a bit further down this page, I've got an account of by a foreign volunteer of what it was like to fight in Avdiivka, if you want to have a look at it. And it talks about how they only lost 10 defenders. And that's how they fought. And then, one of their places, we just piled up dead soldiers outside it, about 100 dead soldiers, Russian soldiers, sorry, and stacked up around the outside of their fortification. And on their side, they lost about 10, which would seem to fit quite well with that 10-to-1 ratio. So when I talked about the 10-to-1 ratio of the like, look at these figures up here, then it's likely that the number of soldiers killed is roughly that same 10-to-1 ratio. It might be more so, because the Ukrainian tanks are much more survivable for the modern ones. But when they're they have a lot of old Soviet gear, and those are just as bad as the Russian ones. But the modern NATO, especially infantry fighting vehicles, which they only lost 20 of. And the modern Ukraine is very much using the badly infantry fighting vehicles because they're much more survivable and much better. Just a second. So that's what Ukraine is doing, and so typically, if a mine hits, or if a badly goes over mine or a shell lands on it, the soldiers all survive. Whereas with a Russian vehicle, the soldiers all die. So it's well believable that, for instance, for those 47,000, just as a guess, Ukraine might have lost 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers. It might have lost less than that, in order to in response to those 47,000. And for 364 tanks, and so they might have lost even just 3,000. It's quite possible. And So the Russians call it the Avdiivka triangle, like the Bermuda Triangle, because soldiers go into it and tanks go into it and they don't come out again. That's the reputation against Russian soldiers, call it that. We need to remember that these are real people that live in this place, like Avdiivka. This was you can go and look at it with the with Google Maps, Bing, Google. You've got the images from above. You can see all these. You can look and zoom in with Bing Maps, and there's lots of photospheres with Google Maps. And you can go and look at a perfectly normal city. It looks quite a nice place if you go and look into it. And the people used to live there, and now this is all that's left of it. And you can watch these. So the people who this always happens in a war, that in Ukraine and in most wars, that there are always a few elderly people, especially sometimes young people, who are just so used to living there and they just can't imagine living anywhere else. And while the Ukrainian and Russian soldiers fighting back and forth and houses being demolished and falling down all around them, they're just sitting at home and hoping that they're going to survive it. And eventually, so this is the so-called the White Angels, and they go through Avdiivka trying to persuade these elderly people to leave their homes. And then sometimes they refuse, sometimes they agree. And they do things like they try to get them on the phone with their relatives, like their children or their other relatives otherwise in Ukraine, and then they try and plead with their elderly mother or father, please, what are you doing in staying behind in Avdiivka? We'll look after you. Come out. I know it's your home. You've lived there all your life, but you're going to die there if you stay. So then these White Angels come and they eventually manage to persuade these elderly peoples sometimes to leave their homes. So it's a real place, and they're just kind of bewildered and sad and saying, what have we done? Why is Russia demolishing our city? What's all this about? So they're not pro-Russian. They're just ordinary people. They're probably pro-Russian in that a lot of the people in this area are very keen on Russian culture, but they're obviously not pro what Russia is doing to their city. And so that's basically what's happening there. And then this last year, I just want to talk just briefly about what happened last year. So last year, I've already talked about those two pockets that Ukraine got through the Russian front line. But the big news last year is what they did with the Black Sea. So the Ukrainians drove the Russian Black Sea fleet out of Crimea. So Sevastopol, that was a very big plus for Russia. It was their big naval base on the Black Sea. It was a huge and very important for them. And that was where they had the headquarters for their Black Sea fleet. And last year, first of all, Ukraine had been sending naval drones which were attacking Sevastopol harbour for some months. Then they destroyed the Sevastopol HQ with the Sparrowhawk, the Storm Shadow, missiles that UK gave supplied to Ukraine. And so the Storm Shadow cruise missile first of all destroyed a nuclear submarine, the first ever nuclear submarine that Russia has lost and the first ever sub since World War II, I think, or no, but certainly for many decades. And it was in dry docks being repaired, and they just destroyed it with these Storm Shadow. And they've destroyed about 20 warships, I think, quite a few landing vehicles, and the Ukrainians, so they hit the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, and the Ukrainians said that they hit it during a war planning meeting of the officers there. That is a valid target in a war, because they are involved in actually directing the war. It's not like attacking Putin, which is not valid, and it's very illegal. but to attack an admiral or a general who, supposed to be an admiral, Sokolov, and he was just there directing who to go where in the war. And the Ukrainians said that they killed him, and Russia denied that, but nobody's heard from him since then. So it seems very likely that the Ukrainians did do what they said they'd done. They killed him and a lot of the officers of the Black Sea Fleet. And then after that, it just became impossible. And then they were destroying Black Sea warships. There was a Black Sea warship in dock in Sevastopol, and they just destroyed it. And before that, the Ukrainians had this. Before all that happened, the Ukrainians had this. They set off in dinghies across the Black Sea, in motorized dinghies, and there were these oil platforms that are no longer producing oil, but they just oil drilling rigs. Sorry, it's a better word for it. And these are being used as were the base for the advanced Russian radar systems that looked over the Black Sea, looked over the eastern part of the Black Sea. And the Ukrainians, and they sailed in dinghies for about, I think, several hundred kilometers from the coast out to these oil rigs. And then there was nobody on them. The Russians didn't have a detachment of people there, they just had equipment. So the Ukrainians then climbed up to the top of these things, and they actually took out the radar thing and brought it back so they could examine it. And in that way, they destroyed a great part of Russia's capability for radar detection of things approaching towards Crimea. And then after that, they then fired lots of. They then attacked the Ukrainian S-300 and S-400 systems in Crimea from the air and destroyed quite a lot of them. They'd already been. They destroyed the command post in Saki Airport. There was a very important ship that was part of the air defences that was in a harbour just next to Kerch Bridge, and they destroyed that. And they've destroyed several landing ships and lots of other ships. And basically, Crimea is no longer a place where Russia can station its warships anymore. So it's moved most of its warships to the very far end of the Black Sea from Ukraine, near Georgia. So they just backed away. They can no longer station them near Crimea because it's just too dangerous. So they positioned them on the far side of the Black Sea. And this, of course, this is partly what led to opening up the grain corridor. Ukraine had got Snake Island in 2022. In 2023, it had pushed the Russians way back. And the Russians, you remember there was all this thing about the Russians blockading the grain corridor in 2022 and into 2023. By the end of 2023, the Russians couldn't do anything about the grain corridor, and Ukraine is just shipping grain out as much as it wants to. So it was a major win by Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine, they have learnt how to use the Patriot air defense systems. They're using them to shoot down fighter jets. They first of all shot down 2-3 fighter jets and I think a couple of fighter jets and some helicopters over Belgorod quite early in 2023. Not that long after they got the Patriot systems. And then they've been shooting down fighter jets using Patriot from time to time since then. And their big thing was they destroyed an airborne command center, one of only 10 in the whole of Russia. And of those, quite a lot of those, I'm not sure how many of those 10 are actually out of action at any time being repaired. And so they destroyed one of them over the Azov Sea. They've destroyed a very expensive strategic bomber using probably cardboard drones from Australia in last year as well. And they have sabotage operations in Russia all the way as far as the border between Russia and China. And the railway line, they sabotaged the railway line between China and Russia to do with military supplies. And then all supplies in the other direction. The Ukrainian drones are flying through, because the Russian air defences, they send most of their air defences to Ukraine to fortify them. And then there, where Ukraine is destroying them. And as a result, the Russians have greatly depleted air defences around Moscow and St. Petersburg. They've also sent all their tanks from Moscow to Ukraine. They lost half of them in 2023. And these are their most advanced, the most modern tanks. They use their most modern tanks to protect Moscow normally, but they're all gone. Half are destroyed or captured by Ukraine, and then the other half presumably still fighting in Ukraine. And when the Wagner, you remember the Wagner rebellion, because they lost the Wagner fighting force in 2022 to 3, when they got the rebellion, they were attacking, and they drove up the motorway to Moscow, and they carried they were transporting some tanks with them, which they're going to use to kind of invade Moscow. Moscow didn't have any tanks to get put onto the streets to meet them. But as you probably all know, nothing came of that. Wagner made an arrangement with Putin, which is a very stupid thing to do, because he eventually probably killed the leader of Wagner. Everyone was saying, you're so stupid, you're going to be killed. But he made an agreement, and it was an agreement that he was supposed to be safe in Belgorod, but he wasn't, because he went back to Russia, and his private jet was shot down by a Russian air defense system. So in that way, Russia lost the Wagner fighting force in 2023. It no longer exists, and there's some relics of it in other countries, but in Russia it no longer exists. The Wagner fighting force was far more nimble, because it could make decisions, and it was somewhat more modern in its fighting techniques. And it wasn't ordered from above by the Russian generals, and that's probably partly why the Russian generals didn't like it very much. But it was much more effective in winning place, and that's how they won Bakhmut. But Bakhmut was the end of the Wagner fighting force, and so Russia doesn't have that anymore. And so that's essentially where we are now. And remember that Russia lost the Battle of Kyiv, it lost the Battle of Kharkiv Oblast, it's lost Kherson City, it lost Izium, and what's the other one? I forget his name. The other city in Luhansk area. And it's many people don't realise Russia only occupies about a fifth of Ukraine, and it's likely to lose more of it very, very soon. So, as you can see, Russia isn't poised on to do a great advance on Ukraine. That doesn't make sense at all. Can you see what I'm saying? The media and you hear the media keep telling you that Ukraine is running out of weapons. This is exaggerations. There's huge amount of supply from Europe, and that's ramping up and up and up. And Ukraine is making its own. Ukraine's going to make 1 million drones this year. So Ukraine is it's got a history of making aircraft engines. It used to make tanks for the Soviet Union. And it's still got tank factories. But it's no longer able to make complete tanks. But it can make tank undercarriages still, and can repair tanks. It used to be very strong on ballistic missiles in the Soviet Union. It's still very strong. It's got its own native-produced Neptune ballistic missile, and a thing called HM2, which may be, they probably don't seem to have very many of them, but from time to time, they destroy things that they shouldn't be able to attack. And it's probably by this native-built missile system, which we'll probably only know details about once the war is over. And so it makes its own artillery, counter-artillery, its own equivalent to its own howitzers. It does its own fighting vehicles. It's got quite a big defence industry, and Ukraine, it was the most military strong country that Russia could have chosen to invade, and because it had no chance of attacking NATO. And the Ukrainian is rising to it, and before the 2022, Ukraine was a big military exporter to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. And many people don't know that. So this idea that Ukraine is just helpless is ridiculous. And every Ukrainian city has underground nuclear bunkers. And the Ukrainians, before the war started, had a much higher level of their population who actually had guns from the Soviet era than in most European countries. They're much more used to fighting. As you can see, there's these big resistance areas in the occupied Ukraine, which are causing problems for Russia. They're constantly causing problems for them. And Russia has not won a valuable area of Ukraine either. So people say, but Russia's going to take over all of Ukraine and it's going to be incredibly strong after that, and it's going to be advanced on NATO. Well, look at what I was saying, that the king of Santi, I've got that graphic, that they're king of the sand. What they've occupied in Ukraine is just like sand castles, because they've destroyed everything of value there. It's been a long time before Mariupol is going to be a valuable asset to Russia. They've got to rebuild the steelworks. They've got to rebuild the entire city. And same also with Avdiivka, same with Bognor. They're utterly useless to Russia. All they've got is a little bit of territory, which they're going to have to completely rebuild. And their economy is just not up to it. It's going to be very difficult for Russia to rebuild occupied Ukraine, assuming that it did hold on to any of it at the end of it. So this idea that they would come out being an economically very strong country at the end of this is nonsense. You're going to be economically very weak at the end of the war. And there's no real prospect of Russia retaking Kherson Oblast, retaking Kherson City. And from Kherson City, then it's Odessa. Further north is Kyiv and Lviv, and there's and the Kharkiv in Kharkiv Oblast. So before this war started, I was reading the military experts, and they were saying Russia needs to take Kharkiv, because if Russia can take Kharkiv, then it's a nexus of communication throughout northeast Ukraine, and then that would be a big then would help them to take the rest of Ukraine. Well, Russia never got near to taking Kharkiv. They started to encircle it. They didn't get very far. Then Ukraine pushed them completely out of the Kharkiv Oblast. And there's no chance of them taking Kharkiv now. And that means they can't get control of these important supply routes in northeast Ukraine. And then we've got Zaporizhia, which is down here somewhere, which is the capital of Zaporizhia Oblast. There's no chance of Russia capturing them. And then the same also with Kherson and Kherson Oblast. So never mind the idea of sweeping over and taking all of Ukraine. They're not going to be able to take either Kharkiv or Zaporizhia or Kherson. They're not going to be able to take those. Never mind going further afield to Lviv or Kyiv or Odessa or something. Never mind attacking Moldova, which some people claim that Russia's going to go all the way through Ukraine and capture Moldova, and that's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. So there's an awful lot of just total nonsense being talked about just now. Look, I should have brought that up large scale. And that's all they've done, and this is what they risk. Yeah, let's just look at them large scale. So I hope you can see that, and then this is what Russia has actually achieved. It's just like a king of a sandcastle. the Avdiivka triangle. Yes, so let's just go through all this and just a quick reminder of all this and to end this. So, yes, so Russia has lost an entire small army of 47,000 and 364 tanks, or whatever the number was. And it has done that to achieve a small city that is basically mainly residential area. That's probably the industrial area. It's got some industry in it, but the industry will be useless to Russia because it'll have flattened it. This shows, you can see how it's just a residential area. There is a railway line that goes through Avdiivka, but it goes to the rest of Ukraine. It's useless to Russia because it's not going anywhere else in Russian-held territory. The Russians have lost huge numbers of tanks and fighting vehicles, and Ukrainians have lost very few in this battle. Ukraine has probably lost a tenth of the soldiers and the fighting, and probably even less than that than Russia has. So as we can see here, they've just filled up a little gap outside a population of 2 million city. It's like capturing Bognor Regis or Palm Springs and then claiming that you're going to take Birmingham or Chicago, having had to use an entire army of 47,000 soldiers. How many soldiers are you going to lose taking Chicago if you lost 47,000 taking Palm Springs, or taking Birmingham if you lost 47,000 soldiers taking Bognor Regis? And so Russia is just king of a sandcastle because there's absolutely no value in what they've captured, because they destroy everything that they capture. Russia is now very vulnerable because they haven't done this sensible thing, which would have been to heal this breach. Instead, they've done a very stupid thing. They should have just left that pocket. There was no point in taking it. And Ukraine is very well poised to do counter-offensive there at some point, as well as from over the Dnieper River. This is the Avdiivka triangle, so Russia has lost vast amounts of soldiers and equipment, just pushed them into there for no great value in order to achieve that little pocket, and they just lost it. Lost all that equipment and all those people. Just to remind that these are real people that live there, and this was a peaceful place where people just led ordinary lives before all this went on, and they've sadly had to evacuate. And this is about, and this is this is the actual what the Russians themselves say about it. You can have a read of that. They don't think much of it. And Russia is being very much damaged by this. And this is about how Ukraine is. So Ukraine is not going to use the Russian strategy. They're not going to send huge waves of Russian soldiers, of Ukrainian soldiers against Tokmak, say. What they're doing instead is they're using technology, like they're going to make 1 million drones in 2024, and ballistic missiles, and also innovators, and then just very clever strategy. And that's the way Ukraine has been doing it. And they've got their much more survivable tanks and much more survivable infantry fighting vehicles. They've got the F-16s coming, and they have got quite a large army, but they will use them properly. They're not going to just send 10,000 or 100,000 Ukrainians in a big wave against Tokmak. They're just not going to do that, and they're not going to send several hundred tanks and lose them all like Russia does. So as we come through to 2024, then most likely Ukraine is sure to do some counter-offensive when the fighting season starts. So nothing is going to happen. Don't expect any counter-offensives before April or May. And then they have to prepare the ground a bit. And then so the main thing with the US bill that's going through Congress is that if the US Congress does approve that, I think the chance is probably quite a bit higher than 50% now, because the Senate sent a very strong message to the House that they wanted passed with a majority of 70 to 29, and that was really that's quite a big message. So the House is in a very difficult position, and it's no wonder that the Speaker of the House said just chicken out of it for the time being, and they've gone on holiday for 2 weeks so that he can come back and then make a decision. But don't worry, Ukraine is not losing this war. Ukraine is well able to hold its place. It's got the Germany stepped up over the winter. They've got their Patriot and systems. They've got the UK Storm Shadows. They've got quite a lot of ammunition. So not all of the million, but they've got quite a lot of ammunition already, and the rest of Europe are trying to work out how to step up to their promise of supplying Ukraine with 1 million rounds of ammunition. The Ukrainian ammunition is far more precise than the Russian. So when you've got a ratio of the Russian doing several for every one of the Ukrainians, then you should just ignore those numbers, because the Ukrainian is far more precise. And so the Ukrainians are well positioned. They're not going to suddenly lose large areas. They're well positioned to hold the front line all the way through to April, May easily. And then Europe is stepping up, and they're going to step up, and certainly they will be able to support Ukraine probably to some counteroffensives in 2024. And then if the US don't come through with their big bill, then maybe the big counteroffensives will be in 2025. And then once Ukraine does, it seems very likely that Ukraine will get to push through there at some point. They will liberate southern Ukraine down to the Azov coast. That seems very likely at some point. Once they've done that, Crimea is incredibly vulnerable. And then the main question would be what happens to East Donbass, and whether Russia managed to hold on to some of that. It seems unlikely that Russia would be able to hold on to Crimea if Ukraine can take southern Ukraine, can liberate southern Ukraine all the way. So if they liberate all the way to Mariupol or something, then this whole area will then be, well, they would then drop the Kerch Bridge, and the Russians would no longer be able to send any military supplies, because remember that Ukraine now is able to hit Russian warships if they go anywhere near Crimea. So it's going to be very hard for Russia. They would need landing ships sailing back and forth from one side of to the other of the Kerch Strait, or whatever it's called, once the Kerch Bridge is gone. And that's not going to be easy for them. So probably at that point they would lose Crimea. And then remember that if Putin realizes he's losing at any time, once he really decides, well, if he decides I am losing, and he says, oh, well, clearly we something's gone wrong here, and we're not good, and if Russia decides that it just can't hold on to occupied Ukraine, then he can simply withdraw. He could come to an agreement. He has to change the Russian constitution and to say that these 4 oblasts are not part of Russia. And then he comes to some peace agreement with Zelensky, and then who knows, maybe they can retain Crimea, maybe they can retain a little bit of Donbass. And if they did some arrangement like that, then Ukraine would probably be very well pleased to end the war, if there was, maybe even with Russia retaining some of the occupied area of Ukraine, for the sake of saving lots of lives. But so Putin could end it at any time, and then it would just be a question of what the terms were, and then there would surely be reparation required as well, that Russia has to help pay to fix the damage that it caused. And then if not, then Ukraine will keep fighting until eventually Russia does give up. And that's what's going to happen. There's no way that and then people talk about, just quickly talk about people say, well, but Russia keeps saying they want a peace ceasefire, so shouldn't Ukraine go for that? No, because if Russia got not from Ukrainians' point of view, there's no way Ukraine is going to agree to that. I'm not saying no objectively, but no from Ukraine's point of view. So the reason is because if Russia desperately wants a ceasefire, because Russia wants to rebuild its minefields all the way along. It's running very low on ammunition, it's running very low on missiles. So it wants to build up huge stocks of those again. And then it wants to refortify the bank of the Dnipro River, which is, as I said, all the mines have been washed away by a big flood. And then all their soldiers, a lot of them have been fighting for 2 years, and they're really, really tired. And the ones that are still alive and still able to fight. And so Russia wants to give them all the rest. And it will need to build more fighter jets, it will need to build up everything that they can. It would return its Black Sea fleet to Sevastopol, and then it would boost up the air defences of Sevastopol, and it would learn from its mistakes and learn why the S-400 is not good enough, and it would improve its S-400 air defence system, and it would just build up against and strengthen its side as much as it can, and then would attack Ukraine again. It would just break whatever agreement it made, just as it broke several agreements by invading Ukraine. At least that is what Ukraine thinks would happen. So you can see why Ukraine is not at all interested in a ceasefire. And then remember, these are real places with real people, and Ukrainian people. It's like like Blackpool or something. They're places where real people live, and that Ukrainian citizens and their relatives, friends live there, or live there, and they're under occupation. They may have some communication with relatives and friends in these occupied areas, and Ukraine naturally wants to liberate them, because the people there in very atrocious conditions. The Russians are committing, are alleged to have committed war crimes, and the evidence is pretty clear that, for instance, the Russians go around forcefully adopting children from Ukrainian families, separating them from their parents, and evacuating them to Russia, and then bringing them up as Russian children. And that is there's very strong evidence for that. The International Criminal Court, that is one of the main reasons why they have indicted Putin, and why Putin, if he ever visits a country that recognised the International Criminal Court, then he will be arrested and he will stand trial. And so there are many countries in the world that Putin can't visit anymore because of those war crimes. Because if he visits, he will be arrested, and then he will have to stand trial in a court. So that is why Ukraine wants to liberate these regions as well. It's partly because the rest of Ukraine will not be safe, and it's partly because they want to liberate it for the freedom of their own citizens who live in these places that are now occupied. And it has never been about attacking Russia. NATO never supplied any weapons that were of any offensive value to Ukraine before the war started, and was very, very reluctant to supply offensive weapons to Ukraine. It's always said, don't use them against Russia, the ones that we supply. And they only supplied a very small amount, just a few Javelin anti-tank weapons at the start of the war, and a few Stinger anti-aircraft weapons. And if Russia had just after the Battle of Kyiv, if Russia had withdrawn completely from Ukraine, at that point, the war would have been over, and it wouldn't have gone on anymore. They could probably have held on to Eastern Donbass at that point, the two separatist areas that they'd declared. If they just withdrawn to those, the areas that were already demarked, and just held on to those and held on to Crimea, then the war would have ended. Ukraine would have gone back to the low-level shelling along the front line in Donbass. NATO wouldn't have supplied anything more except what it already had to Ukraine. If at the end of the Battle of Kyiv Russia had done that, then they could have come to some peace agreement too. But instead, Russia counterattacked and then it started attacking Mariupol and so on, and it gradually took over the whole of Mariupol and etc. etc. So, and it was shortly after the Battle of Kiev that the Bucha atrocities were unearthed. Anyway, so hopefully that gives, and do remember that this is all just a few soldiers are doing the atrocities. It's just Putin is directing this. Your average Russian soldier on the front line in this battle just doesn't have a clue what's going on. Many of them are from rural areas of Russia and they just feel that they're fighting loyally for Russia. They believe the narrative that NATO is attacking Russia or something like that. They don't really have much idea. Russians, for some reason, have they feel a need to fight for their country, and if you're brought up in Russia, then you think, well, it's my duty. I've got to go off and fight for Russia, and if the general orders me into the battle and I die, well, that's my fate, as it were. That's my life is all about. And so the Russian fighters, they're in an awful situation too, and your average Russian soldier. So, and then remember that there's always kindness, like these white angels rescuing the elderly people in Avdiivka before it was too late for them. And there'll be people on the Russian side, and there are lots of very good Russian people. So Russian people as a whole are kind, they're honourable, they're good people. They're confused by Russian propaganda. They have a fine tradition, fine history, and it just Putin is completely screwing it and messing around with it. And then Putin himself, then he is not in a good position as a person. So you can be very sorry for Putin too. I know it may sound strange to do that, to say that, but imagine, I don't think most people want to like, suppose you're given the option, the rest of my life I'll be Putin, or the rest of my life I'll be myself. Who would want to be Putin? Don't think many people would. His life is awful. It's just one of the worst possible lives you could imagine having. So it is possible to actually feel some compassion for Putin too, and he can't undo what he did with his life. And it's not very likely, but you could imagine, suppose that Putin had a kind of revelation and he realized that he's been going wrong all his life. I just turned around in his person and realized that he made a huge mistake in his choice of his life path. And then imagine what it'd be like for him in that situation. And you can kind of, although it's not at all possible, it's hardly beyond credible, it just doesn't happen. It's very incredibly rare for anyone to do that. But you can wish for him to do that. And so I think it's quite good in your mind to just say, oh, I just so wish that Putin, I know it's totally unrealistic, but wouldn't it be wonderful if Putin could just wake up and realize what's happened, what he's doing, and say, well, how did I end up like this? What can I do about it? How can I help? What can I do to make the world a better place and to move into a better place in my life? And that is so that's, you can wish for that, and it doesn't matter that it's not at all realistic. Still, that wish, I think, is quite healthy for one's own mind. So instead of having like hate for Putin, you just say, in your own mind, just to say, I so wish that Putin could be aware of what's happening, realize what a mess he's got himself into, realize how he's completely mixed up, and he's just not in a real, he's not really grounded properly in the world as it is. He doesn't understand other people properly. He doesn't understand them in the way that really matter. Like, he doesn't really know what suffering is in other people, not really, or he couldn't do this. And just wish that he could appreciate all that. And then that wish can make your whole mind much more positive about the whole thing. And it's not going to change the war. It's not going to end the war. Putin isn't actually going to go like that just because you wish he would be like that. But having that wish transforms your own mind, and in a small way it can help other people around you. It can help you to, if you're debunking and helping scared people, then if you're in a positive frame of mind yourself, then you're going to be able to do it in a more positive way. So that is quite a good way of helping with your mind. And then you never know, it might, he might change in some fundamental way. He's probably end up in prison for the rest of his life. Imagine if he was. That's another thing that could happen, is that depending many ways this war could end up with a breakup of the Russian Federation. It could end up with someone else taking over. They could end up with a democracy in Russia. It's not impossible. There could be a situation in the future where Putin stands trial in the International Criminal Court. He's surrendered by the Russians as they are then, when they realise what's going to happen. So this scenario that I just described is the sort of thing that maybe sometimes prisoners, when they've been in prison for a long time and they have time to reflect on what they've done, and there's just nothing else that they can do. He can no longer order armies around, and he's just in prison because of his criminal offences. Then that's another way that his mind could change at some point. It's not impossible. And then he might be full of regret, and then he might find a way forward into a more positive frame of mind. So there's nothing. That's quite a good positive way of handling this sort of situation. So anyway, I hope this helps some of you to come on a little bit more positive, and certainly and be less worried about this war, and to approach it a bit more positively. And there's nothing even remotely World War about this. As you can see, when Russia can't even take eventually just struggles so hard to take tiny city the size of Bognor Regis,